right along in here near the Zelnaga Towers. Okay, the next game we'll go into is Green Acres, which is a pretty balanced map for all the races then. Next map we're on to here is Green Acres. This map is made more for defense than it is for offense. The ramp is still fairly large, so if you are going to do some kind of early aggression, it's not impossible on this map, but it's not really recommended. In general, expansions are pretty easy to take because once you do take them, there's really only two places that the enemy can come through, and it's a fairly narrow choke, so in general you're always going to have some kind of concave when you're engaging enemy forces. It's not an awful map for Zerg, but in general Zerg is forced to expand on this map just because if there are two Terran or two Protoss on this map, which there usually are because most Terrans and Protoss keep this map up, you're going to find that they can easily block off this middle area here, and if you do an early pull strategy, you're going to find yourself behind economically throughout the entirety of the game. Drops and Blink Stalkers are by far the strongest strategies on this map, as well as DT Warpins and other things that are on the high ground here, because you're going to notice this cliff here is very long along either side of the bases here. So this makes it pretty much impossible to defend drops and Blink Stalkers effectively without having a significant number of turrets or having a very mobile army which can take down drops or Blink Stalkers pretty effectively. Especially since if you are out here defending your expansions, Blink Stalkers can easily come back here, and there's a very long distance you have to travel to try and get back and defend in time. Tanks will become very powerful later in the game, as well as Colossus, because as mentioned before, this area here is pretty narrow in general for most maps, and Colossus and tanks are going to be very strong as a result of that. Also the fact that once you do get tanks kind of sieged up here, there's not really a whole lot of space where you can kind of circumvent and go around and try and take out the tanks from behind. And since you can get tanks on this map, that's what really is going to make it easy to defend this kind of third expansion here. Because the third expansion on this map, you either have this one right here, or this one right here. And both of these are pretty far off from where the center two ones are. So two people are going to get pretty easy to defend expand, while the other person is going to be stuck with one that's kind of off to the side, and it's going to be really difficult to defend. Timing pushes tend to be the strongest strategy on this map, just because one team will usually expand and then the other team will try and deny their expansion. And I think that more or less covers what common strategies take place on this map. There's some other kind of shenanigans that can take place here, like cannon rushes and whatnot, but they're not too common just because with a shared base it's a little bit easier to defend your allies. So the next game I'll get into is the map Temple of Preservers, and that map is pretty balanced as well, even though all the bases are split up. Okay, here's the next map, Temple of Preservers, and this map is pretty even for all races, although in general I would say that it favors Terran. Mostly because there's an island expansion, also the fact that once you kind of get later into the game, tanks become really strong at kind of holding the center of the map and also basically sieging up people who are on the outside here who have production buildings at this point. You're going to notice that early on in the game, mobile armies is going to be best just because if we take a look over here, once you get down outside the ramp, there's a lot of wide open space, which means armies that can kind of control this middle area here during the early portion of the game, deny expansions, are really going to have an advantage. Also, mobile armies is going to be great because since the bases are all split up, you can easily kind of bounce back and forth from one base until you find a vulnerability in your opponents. But the map isn't all bad for defense because the ramps are pretty narrow and the rush distance is quite long. If you notice from this side of the map and you go all the way over here, it's pretty long. That's 4, 5, maybe even 6 screen lengths between this side of the map and the other side of the map all the way up here. For that reason, expansions aren't impossible to take on this map. If you can control the center of the map, expansions are pretty easy to defend because most of the time your army is going to be sitting right along in here and also in here in preparation for any kind of timing push that may come. But since the expansions are out in the open, unless if you're a Zerg player, it's not the best for defense because Protoss like their force fields, and Terran players don't like situations where they can get a giant concave against them or have to fight out in the open. They like choke points as well, especially if they're trying to defend with tanks. But Terran is also very strong on this map because you're going to notice that there's a lot of ridges along here which make it great for drops. So not only is island expansions something that only Terran can do, but drop ships are going to be very annoying on this map. Even if it's a warp prism, it's still going to be difficult to defend. And I think that pretty much covers most of the points on this map. Kind of for the same reason that drops are good on this map, Mutalisks are also fairly good, although this player back here is going to be more or less protected just because there's not a whole lot of dead space along the backside, so if Mutalisks do get back there, there's not really much of a place for them to go. But usually games don't last that long because early pool strategies will usually take one player out, and then it's kind of more of a defensive game after that point. Okay, the next map will be the Biolab, which is kind of a more Terran and Zerg favored map than anything else. This is the next map in the map pool. It's the Biolab. It's a very offensive oriented map because all the bases are split up for one thing. The ramps are fairly large for most of the bases, and also the fact that there is no ramp. So if you're trying to force field something off here, you can't do it. So teams that have 2 Zergs or more, or else just teams in general that have more Zergs, are going to have a great deal of fun on this map because you're going to be able to contain your opponents for a good portion of the game, get expansions up quicker, and that's really going to allow you to do a lot more variety of strategies. Protoss isn't necessarily bad on this map because you're going to notice there's a lot of space along the outside where they can actually do warp-ins onto the high ground with an Overlord, and this can be very devastating if you do a couple of Zealots in there and the other team doesn't notice and they have it in their mineral line. So teams with a lot of Zergs, whether they have a Terran or Protoss partner, are going to do pretty well on this map. Terran's going to get even better later in the game because once you start doing drops, there's a lot of space. Just like for warp-ins, you can do drops, and it's very difficult for teams to defend because usually they're sitting up here defending their expansions, and it takes a long time to get all the way back into their base. Another thing that's great for Terran is once you do get tanks, these expansions become very easy to defend because the ramps bunch up units very badly, plus the Xel'Naga Tower overlooks the largest ramp, so if other teams are coming up, you're always going to see it coming for one thing, and for two, it's going to make it very easy to defend and cost efficient for your team. And since the rush distance from the expansions is very short, it's really only one screen length, tank pushes are very difficult to stop, and most of the time games aren't going to get to the point where players are able to take these outside expansions. Usually once the team already has these expansions, the game was over anyways. So in general, this map isn't going to make for terribly long games, although they might last 15 minutes or so just because there's expansions out here. The expansions are easy to defend, but that's really the only part of this map that's easy to defend. Everything else comes down to kind of who's the most aggressive early on, and Protoss players are probably in general going to hate this map, whereas Zerg and Terran players most of the time will like this map. Okay, now time for the last map in the map pool, Ulaan Deeps, and I'll get to that in just one sec. This is the last map in the 3 vs 3 map pool. This is Ulaan Deeps, and this map is kind of like Temple Preservers, except it's flipped on its side. It's also got much shorter rush distances than the other map, so it's going to be a little bit harder to defend on this map. However, the ramps are small, so it's not too difficult, even as Protoss, because you can easily just make one force field here and keep opponents out. It does favor Terran and Zerg teams a little bit more, just because with all the split bases, it's pretty easy to harass opponents. However, you're going to notice on the bottom left of the map here and the top right of the map here, it's not too difficult for a Terran player or even a Protoss and Terran player to block this area off and prevent the other team from being able to break into their bases. This will make it a little bit easier to ensure that if you do lose your partner who's kind of set off on his own across the map, that you still have some way to defend the two bases together and then do some kind of timing push to do a counterattack a little bit later in the game. Speaking of later in the game, the expansions are all very easy to defend. Even this one up here is pretty easy to defend because once you get tanks set up or you have enough force fields, you can easily kind of split off these open areas in the middle where people try and rush across the map and take out your expansions. Games don't tend to last very long on this map though, because once these expansions are taken, usually whichever team takes them first has a pretty big advantage, and the team with more Terrans will tend to win the late game because tank pushes are very potent on this map. You can get contains very easily. The rush distance, once you do have your expansions up, is very short. It's only about 1 to 2 screen lengths here, and also the fact that you can start sieging opponents' production buildings if they have them built up at the front of their ramp to try and block off against any kind of early ling aggression or something like that. Drops are also quite potent on this map, and that's another thing that makes Terran very difficult to deal with, because you're going to notice back here there's places where the dropships can completely circumvent each of the bases and avoid detection or being shot down. So Terran players are going to have a lot of fun on this map, especially if they have a couple Zerg partners, and Protoss players aren't necessarily going to hate this map, but it's pretty difficult for Protoss. Although if your team does have more Zergs, then high ground warpins are very strong because there's a lot of long cliffs along the edge of the map, which make it easy to warp into enemy bases. And also the fact that since it's only a one force field ramp, sometimes you can completely block one of the enemies in their base for being too defensive, and then go and take out their partner and just keep force fielding the ramp. Alright, well that kind of covers the 3v3 map pool for you guys. So hopefully you've checked out some of my other videos and even my guide that I've posted online. Alright, well thanks for watching, and I'll have more videos for you very soon.